Now, you might be wondering, right? Man, there's a lot of things that seem to be being compared to Jesus. And we've gone through them, how Jesus is better than the angels, Jesus is better than the priests, Jesus is better than whatever you want to put in there. Why were these early Christians, why was the author of Hebrews having to write this again and again? And it's because individuals had crept into the church who were trying to cheapen what Jesus had already done and had accomplished. And these guys were either from the more Jewish camp or they were Gnostic. And when I say Gnostic, you'll remember that we talked about how these were individuals who were looking for a higher wisdom. And so they looked around and they said, wow, if we just took a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of mysticism, we would have this higher knowledge which would allow us to ascend to heaven. And again, it's the idea that it was an intellectual work, right? That's what Gnosticism is. Judaism, right, was mostly a works-based, right? I do X, Y, and Z, and therefore I come closer to God. And what the author of Hebrews is trying to say here, and he's portraying, is that Jesus is better than all that. Jesus is better than the striving. And we talked about how Jesus gives us rest. Tonight, we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 7, and we're going to talk about how Jesus is better than the priest. Jesus doesn't just represent you, he intercedes for you. Right? There's this idea that you can represent somebody, right? I represent Joe here in the corner. But when I'm interceding, it means that I have a personal relationship with the one who was offended. Right? And so I'm able to broker more deal, more power, because I know both parties. And so what Jesus does for us as our priest is that he intercedes for us. He goes, hey, I know that Luke sinned again today. I know he said he was never ever going to sin again. I know that he repented. I know he said all that. But I paid for his sins already. And he intercedes between us and the Father. And later on, we're going to talk about how there's only one mediator between Christ and man. It is Christ Jesus. And so for us, I want us to develop that idea. But if I'm going to give you some handles on the passage tonight, these are the handles, right? A different kind of priest. A better covenant. Jesus is our permanent and perfect priest. Now, this idea of a better covenant is going to be explained more in chapter 8, right? As we've been kind of talking, is that the author of Hebrew starts an idea, continues on the idea, and then halfway through the chapter break, which is not actually written by him, that's just what we put in there to make it easy to find things, he switches to a new topic, right? And so he's building almost a staircase argument. And he's continuing to lay the bricks down for why Jesus is better. And we talked about already that Jesus is better than the high priest, right? And we talked about the Levitical priesthoods, how was not sinless, was chosen by God, was a man. And we talked about the failings of an earthly priest, right? They represented only some people. Offer sacrifices, are limited by weakness, limited atonement. They weren't able to make a blanket atonement. They had to make individual atonements, which meant that a lot of animals died, right? Without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sin. And so this was a constant repetition of slaughter, of slaughter, of slaughter, just to pay for sins. They even understood that if you had a negative thought, if you had a bad thought while you were offering, man, this line's taking forever, I'm never ever going to get through this, they would say that you have to offer a sacrifice for that. And so this whole entire system was created on that. Next, we went into the part that was a little bit of a wake-up call for us, right? We talked about how the author of Hebrews wants to go on to deeper truths. However, he's again having to explain the elementary principles, right? The fundamental truths. But he wants us to get to the deeper stuff. He wants us to get to the meat of the matter. And in fact, in that chapter, he teases Melchizedek. He says, oh, I would love to talk more about Melchizedek, but you have become dull of hearing, right? Not that you can't hear, is that you've become dull. You've drowned it out. You've tuned me out. And so for us as individuals, I don't want us to lose sight of what the fundamentals are. But I also don't want us to become so familiar with them that we drown them out. Jesus loves me. Yep, I got that. Yep, Jesus died for my sins. Yep, I got that. I want you to fall in love with the gospel again and again. I want that passion that you have for the gospel to fuel you going forward. And so finally, we get to the chapter where we'll cover Melchizedek. Now, I will be honest with you. There is a lot of information out there about Melchizedek. Some of it is saying that he's a theophany, a Christophany, was born circumcised. I don't know how that happens, but literally was just born circumcised. The genealogy, right? He is not really a priest, but yet he is, but he's outside of it. Is this a different type of model, right? Is he a supernatural or angelic figure, right? And so you would almost see how when we talked about in chapter 1, we talked about like Jesus is better than the angels, right? That they were thinking maybe, you know what, Melchizedek, he's an angel figure, right? And they would maybe even go back and they would say, hey, the other guy in the furnace during Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's just an angel. See how powerful angels are? And they would continue to kind of have that idea be built and built to build. And we already talked about angelology, so I really won't get into that. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I really like Melchizedek. In fact, I was probably in the beginning of high school when I kind of found out about Melchizedek, and then I really went off the deep end. Like, all I talked about was Melchizedek. I could point you to it. I could tell you about Christophanies. I could tell you everything. And then my dad sat me down one day and says, there's more to the Bible than those 3 verses and the ones in Hebrew. I'm like, the Psalms. And he says, yes, I know there's a few verses on him. But tell me more about Jesus. Let's go into the complexities of who he is. This is fun, right? It's exciting to look into this, but I don't want you to lose the focus on Jesus, right? It's interesting, but the main thing, right? And it talks about how it was a shadow of things to come, right? We get to see the real thing. So let's dwell and let's meditate. Let's fix our eyes on the real deal. However, let's go back and look, because the author of Hebrews decides that it's worth it to write about this. And this is not a time when like texting was nice and free, or you could just speak into your phone and say, talk about this guy, blah, 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 blah. No, he actually had to think about it. He actually had to write it out. It was expensive. And so why does he put this focus on Melchizedek? I hope to tell you a little bit about that. So turning your text to Hebrews chapter 7, starting in verse 1. For this, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, and to him Abraham appointed a 10th part of everything. He is first, by a translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. Now, the author of the Hebrews, he presents the idea of who Melchizedek is, but he's also operating off of the idea that you have read Genesis, and that you fully understand what Genesis is all about, because he's writing to a predominantly Jewish audience, or those who are interested in the Jewish texts. And so the name Melchizedek means Melech, right, king, and Zedek, right, is righteousness. And so his literal name is the King of Righteousness. And so for us, right off the bat, alarm bells should be going off. Names in the Old Testament are important. They mean something for a reason. So this is not King okay. This is not King This is the King of Righteousness. That's his name. That's what he's either been given, or that's the name that he's been given to aspire to. And so we know that he is a king, right? His name even says that he's the King of Righteousness. But he's also the King of Salem, right? And it's the idea of the King of Peace, Shalom, right? It's that whole idea of Salem, right? In which we then would get Jerusalem. And so this is the early area that would become Jerusalem during the time of the kings, during the time of Saul and of David, right? And so this is a early time. So I don't know if you know this, but when you go visit Salem, Massachusetts, right, it's named after Jerusalem, right? And now it's kind of crazy, a little bit Gothic, but, they had witch trials. Here's the thing. We lose the fact that names are important, right? And so he's the king of righteousness from Jerusalem. Those are your big ticket items. Now, if you're a Gnostic, you are salivating at this. You're like, whoa, that's deep. I can't believe that. All of that is true. Who is this great Melchizedek guy? If you're a Jewish individual, you're like, yeah, that's part of our history, right? That's literally what we know. And if you open up Genesis, right, you can see that he's also presented as a priest. Even our text in Hebrew says that. It says that he's a priest. Now we'll get into that because it's an interesting turn of phrase. Priest of the Most High God. Now, for us, we have to set the stage and we have to go back to Genesis. So we know that Adam is in the beginning of Genesis, and somewhere down the line there is Father Abraham. Now, Abraham is told by God, right? Now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Abraham gets this message. He communes with God, right? Up until this point, we really don't know, right? God is there, but it seems to not have been as central as a focus. And all of a sudden you get to Abraham, and he becomes a central focus. And you see this again, that he's worshiping, he's praying. God starts talking to Abraham. And then it said, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in all of you the families of the earth shall be blessed. So he has this immense weight, but this immense promise that is given, right? You're going to leave everything that you know and go after what I have told you. And if you do this, right, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. Now the funniest thing is, right, notice it says, right, you need to leave your kindred, right? He doesn't. He brings around cousin Lot. Now cousin Lot becomes a little bit of a thorn in the flesh for Abraham, right? He definitely is just kind of this side character, but they're all moving towards the promised land, right? The land of milk and honey. It is this idea that it's Israel and the land that's inside of it. And so finally Abraham makes it to that area. And he gets up on a hill and he overlooks everything. And this is very much kind of like a Simba moment, right? He's sitting there and he says, all that you see is our land. And Lot's just there and he goes, yeah, I really don't want this nice rocky soil up here. I want to go down to that city over there. And so cousin Lot goes all the way down to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah were not upstanding towns, right? They were fantastic, they were thriving, but they were also filled with sin. And God was always throwing judgments at Sodom and Gomorrah. But because Lot looked with his eyes and said, wow, that's delightful, that looks good, that is prosperous to me, he went and moved down there. Abraham, on the other hand, went and stayed up in the mountainous kind of region, the more hilly area, and that made sense because he had a lot of sheep. And so that's where he is currently. Now, why am I giving you all of this kind of history, right? Because the story of Melchizedek picks up in Genesis chapter 14 and verse 11. Now it says this, so the enemy, right, and these were 4 different kings who decided, you know what, we are going to capture this area, we're going to force them to pay taxes, and guess what? People didn't like paying taxes for some reason. I don't know, but they got a little mad about it. They had a little revolution. They said, hey, we're not going to pay your taxes. And you know what they did, these 4 kings? They said, you know what, we're going to take all your stuff. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And if you're righteous, you're like, yes, they finally got their just desserts. But then Abraham also knows that his cousin Lot is there. And it says this, and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abraham's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. And so all of a sudden, these kings, these four kings, look at the land and say, man, Sodom and Gomorrah, we're just going to take it. And they go in and they just nab individuals. And they just hold them, take them back, and just snatch them immediately. Now, once they snatch them, this is what it says. When Abraham heard his kingmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his household, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them to Hobath, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. And so Father Abraham, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, becomes warrior Abraham. And he puts on his full tactical gear, and he does a successful nighttime raid. And he goes and he grabs his cousin Lot and takes him back. Now, one of the things that is also said in this text is after his return from defeat of Chaldon, the kings who were with him and the kings of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shiva, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And so all of a sudden, you have this strange figure just appear. Melchizedek, he just appears onto the scene. There is no mention of him beforehand. There is no mention of him in the lines that are to follow. And he comes out and he presents both bread and wine. Now, if you are paying attention to this, you go, bread and wine. I've heard this one somewhere before. Where have I heard it? It's because it's proto-communion, right? Jesus had a very similar meal with his disciples, and we celebrate it as communion, right? He makes a covenant. He makes a blessing with it. Now, is it a far stretch to say that this is communion and that Abraham is being offered communion? Probably not. Is it a similarity? Yes. Would I go and say that, Abraham is offered communion 100% here? No. Because we still haven't uncovered who is Melchizedek. But why does he offer this? That is the interesting part. Now, the next thing I want to draw your attention to, right, is he was priest of God Most High. Now, I want you to think through your biblical timeline real quick with me, right? So you have Adam, right? Adam sins, everything goes with the fall, sin, death, diseases, everything has entered the world, right? Father Abraham is down the line a little bit. And between them, Moses and Abraham is roughly 600 to 700 years. And then you have the 40 years of wandering. And during that time, God has established the different ways in which you would come and pay for your sins, right? And so Jesus paid the first sin, right? He said, I will sacrifice this lamb, right? And I will make a covering for you. Next, he institutes, right, the altar. And he says, you will offer this. And that's why Cain and Abel, right, they have this fight because one doesn't offer a good sacrifice. And then you get Father Abraham, and you get circumcision, and you also get the stars. But then you get Moses, and you get the Ten Commandments, you get the Ark of the Covenant, and you get the priesthood. Beforehand, there were no priests. So why is Melchizedek called the king and also priest? And he is the priest of the Most High God? This is a question that should probably start to bug you a little bit. You go, where is he getting his priesthood? Now, I did a lot of research, right? As I said, and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that people will say is that obviously you need to remember that Noah happened. And so Noah has the flood, and then God gives him a promise. Noah builds an altar afterwards, and he offers what would be clean sacrifices, right? He doesn't offer things that would be unclean. He offers things that would be clean. He then passes that to Shem. And then Shem passes it on to Melchizedek. And then Melchizedek then blesses Abraham. I hate to tell you this, but nowhere in the text is this actually found. And it's actually from a non-canonical book that is written during the time of Jesus do we actually get this idea that Shem had a priesthood and Melchizedek was a part of this priesthood. And it comes out of Qumran, right? And these were individuals who were zealots, and they probably had some messed up theology. And these guys were the guys who wrote like the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they're working off of Old Testament and also some of the Jewish fables and myths. And so this recording that Shem was this priesthood and that he passed it on to Melchizedek is from there. Has no basis in the text. And in fact, we see that we look at the life of Shem, it doesn't even line up with who he is as an individual, nor does it line up with Noah that he had this priesthood. That is just one explanation that people give for that. So we're left with a guy named Melchizedek who is king and priest and non-Aaronic. Now, this non-Aaronic means that he's not of the line of Aaron. He's not a high priest in the order of Aaron. He's outside of this line. He is both king and priest. We can take a look at the life of Saul. Saul is waiting for the prophet to come and bless him and to bless the battle. He can't wait any longer. He's so impatient that he makes the offering and sacrifice on the altar rather than waiting for the prophet. And because he does that, right, Samuel tells him, doom is coming to your kingdom. The way that you tore my cloth here of my robe, seems like the way that the kingdom would be torn away. Israel was not supposed to have a priest and a king in the same person. Those were supposed to be two different establishments. And so this guy is really interesting because he comes before that. Now I want you to notice in Genesis chapter 14 verses 19-20 says, and he blessed him and said, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now this idea of the tenth, right, is something that is a little bit maybe confusing to us. But this tithe was something that was offered when you were making something known and giving it to God. Saying, hey God, I'm giving you the first fruits. I know that you were responsible for this victory. I know that you were responsible for this overflowing. And so I'm giving you back a portion because I know that you will provide for me. And so Abraham, even though the tenth really hadn't been established, he does it. He understands that this is an important guy. He understands that he's a priest of the Most High God. He understands that he's been given a blessing. And so he, in return, gives a portion. Now we jump back into our text in Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3. It says this, he is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. Now, there are about 14,000 documentations and individuals who are presenting theses for their doctoral on whether or not that word resembling means like the same exact thing, or if it's just a picture. It's like he's kind of like, or is he exactly like? And so you have two different options, right? He literally had no parents and just appeared and eternal, or he was a person, lived and died, however, just appears/disappears so suddenly that it's like he doesn't have a genealogy. Now, those who would camp in that he is a literal person would also point out to you that in all of the genealogies that are given in the book of Genesis, he is not included. He is nowhere to be found. Every time that a major character comes onto the scene in the book of Genesis, they get a genealogy. Who is unanimously not included in any of them? Melchizedek. He just appears. And the author of Hebrews is pointing back, saying the Son of God is like this, right? But we go, hey, we know Mary. That's not the point. The idea is that his kingship and his priesthood is coming from somewhere else. And that's really the main argument and main point that the author is trying to get to. Continue on our text, it says, "See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the spoils." Again, Abraham was the big dog of the Old Testament, right? It went Abraham, Moses, right? Those were the main figures that everybody looked up to, right? It's interesting, we have this really big affinity for Daniel, but for the Jewish people, they didn't have like this super fascination with him. We do, but they don't. You know who they did? Abraham, David, Moses. Those were their big guys, and they said those were our people. Those are our history right there. And so for them, the author of Hebrews is saying, look, the big guy himself gave a tenth of the spoils to him. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithe from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descendants from Abraham. So again, he's building out this idea that Abraham gave 10% to Melchizedek. And he's saying that later on, Moses establishes this in Numbers. To the Levites, I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance, in return for their service that they do in their service in the tent of meeting, so that the people of Israel do not come near the tent of meeting, lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall do the service of the tent of the meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity. It shall be a perpetual status throughout your generations and among the people of Israel. They shall have no inheritance. So the tribe of Levi was to have no inheritance. Remember how we talked about in the book of Joshua? They had the Levitical cities, right? And they had their areas of refuge. They didn't have an allotment in the land. This was so that God would be present in all of the places. He wasn't he wasn't put into a particular place in this particular area and just kept there. He was supposed to be out, allowing for them to do good works, to see good deeds, and also to have a way to God through the Levitical priesthood. But there was a catch. They needed money. They needed a way to make their living. And so the way that God provided for them was through this tithe. And so people of Israel, would give 10% to the Levitical priesthood. And this is what was used to upkeep the temple, used to buy sacrifices, used to buy incense, used to just buy food, dough, all that kind of stuff, anything that they would need. And so the author of Hebrews is building this idea, saying, hey, you guys know of the Levitical priesthood, but I'm saying that there's one better than the Levitical priesthood. And he continues on his argument and says this man who does not have his descendants from them received tithe from Abraham. does not have their descendants from them, meaning he's outside of the tribes of Israel, because they haven't been. They're not yet there. They haven't been established. There's still a twinkle in their dad's eye, right? It's the idea that these are generations to come from Abraham and blessed him who had the promise. Did Melchizedek have the promise? No. Abraham had the promise. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. Now that should be very interesting to you, that he lives. And we'll kind of develop that idea a little bit later, but you see that because Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, he is able to bless Abraham. He comes from a higher position, and therefore the blessings can kind of roll down, right? He has a position in which to bless. Now, in 1 Corinthians, we read this: "For I delivered to you as of first importance that I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." Now, if you notice that he was raised on the third day in accordance to the Scripture, it means that he lives. And notice that the author of Hebrews is saying that Melchizedek, he lives, right? And so I think that we're trying to see that the author of Hebrews is saying that Jesus' priesthood is a better priesthood because it's not in the Levitical sense. It's not in the Aaronic sense. He's a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then the author of Hebrews says this. One might even say that Levi himself, right, the father of the Levitical tribe, right, who received tithe, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. This idea that Abraham and his descendants paid a tithe to Melchizedek because Abraham did it. And so he's saying that everybody in Israel paid a tithe to the Levitical priest. But even the Levitical priest, they paid a tithe to Melchizedek. And so again, it's hard, and I know that there's a lot of different things that are running around, but the author of Hebrews is continuing to hammer home the point. Melchizedek is better. And here's what he's going to do. Here's his little bait and switch. He's going to pump up Melchizedek super high. And he says, you know what? You know what's better than Melchizedek? Jesus. And so what he's doing right now is he's going to inflate Melchizedek. But in just a sec, he's going to be like, there's someone bigger, better than him, right? It's the idea that there's always a bigger fish. There's something always that is going to be larger. In the case, it's Jesus. Now we get into this section that is on a better covenant. Now this is the beginning of the covenantal talk in which the author of Hebrews is going to start his dialogue. Now, we really don't think in the term of covenants, right? We don't think in the term of promises. But in the ancient world, the idea of a covenant was that you would take a lamb, you would take a goat, you would take a bull, and you would cut it up in pieces. And the two parties would walk in between the pieces, saying that if I break this covenant, let what happened to this cow happen to me. Now, when God makes a covenant with Abraham, he is the only one who walks through it, saying that if anything that I don't say comes true, then this can happen to me. He doesn't let us hold the responsibility. Jesus holds the responsibility fully of this covenant. So let's dive into the text. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, he is starting an early jab at the law and how it is not perfect, right? The law is a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, right? Its idea is that it's a reflection. It tells you that you have sinned, but doesn't tell you how to deal with sin forever. It tells you that you're wrong, but doesn't offer you a solution to make it right. What further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron, right? So if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, then why would there need to be another after the order of Melchizedek? Why did I spend the last 10 verses hyping up Melchizedek? Because the Levitical priesthood was not the final thing. There was a coming priesthood that would succeed it in all aspects. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessary a change in the law as well. There were old laws and rules and regulations that ran everything. But when the new priesthood takes over, there would be a new law. Notice that there is a certain type of law when Melchizedek is the high priest. When Aaron gets his priesthood, there are new laws that are associated with it. And when Christ comes as our high priest, there's a new law. In fact, this is what we read in Galatians. For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for it is righteousness where through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. Paul, the author of Hebrews, are in agreement, right? That I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for nothing. If you were able to use the law, or if you were able to use the Old Testament Levitical priesthood, then you could be saved. Why did Jesus die then? We should all be in a Levitical priesthood. You guys should be listening to a rabbi. But no, there is a new order. And that's what the author of Galatians and the author of Hebrews is all pointing us to. And in fact, right, we know that back in the day, that was the law. Whatever the priest said, what the Ten Commandments, what the Torah said, what the Pentateuch said, all of it. But now that Christ has come, right, he supersedes what had gone before it. He is the new. He is the new mode of salvation, and he is not temporary, he is eternal. Eventually, right, every other priest eventually stepped down, right? They eventually got too old, they got too tired, they eventually wore out, they were sinful, right? Jesus sat down because the work was finished, but his advocacy continues. He's going to continue to advocate for us. He's going to continue to intercede for us. And so you don't have to be worried that Jesus is going to run out of steam one day, or Jesus is going to run out of being generous or being merciful. No, this is a priesthood forever. The idea that it's going to be perpetual. It's going to continue on. The author of Hebrews says this: for the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe. Now he's going to switch to Jesus, from which no one has ever served at the altar. The only way that you served at the altar was if you were a Levitical priesthood. If you didn't, you died, right? Notice that somebody in the Bible went up to go study the Ark of the Covenant as it was being brought along on an ox cart. He touched it to stabilize it, to make sure it didn't fall in the mud. And God said, nope, not of the tribe of Levi. And in fact, the text goes out of its way to tell you he was not Levitical. Because God said, you will relate to me in one way. And that's how he did it in the Old Testament. And now he's telling you that there is only one way to God, which is through Christ Jesus. For it is evident that our Lord was descendant from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priest. And so, if you remember, right, you have the original patriarchs. You have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob eventually becomes Israel. And Israel has the 12 tribes of Israel. And out of that, Moses, then while he's over the tribes in the wandering time and in the Exodus, he says only one group out of the tribes is going to be. And then he says that's the tribe of the Levites. Funny story, right? He's also a Levite, and so people start to go like, hey, that's nepotism. Hey, I want to be the Levitical. Hey, I want to serve God. Hey, I want to do that. And they started to rebel. And you know what God's solution to that was? Open up the ground and let them be swallowed. God was not joking around. He kept the priesthood cleaned and pure, and it was very particular about who served and who didn't serve. And so we know that Jesus, right, comes out of the line of Judah, right? And that's the Davidic line, right? Remember the Davidic promises, the Davidic covenant, that, hey, out of you will come the King of Kings, the one who will rule Israel forever. And Jesus comes out of the tribe of Judah, which is why Luke and Matthew go out of their ways to tell you the genealogies, because they're saying, look, he is of the kingly line. The kingly was a promise, right? And we'll go a little bit more into that a little bit later. It's the idea that he has both the kingship and he has the priesthood of Melchizedek. So therefore he can be both priest and king at the same time. Now we see that he is both priest and king, even though he is outside of that, right? He is not a part of the priestly line. He's not of Levi, but he is part of the kingly. And notice what it says in verses 15 and 17. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. In the likeness, he's both king and priest. He's outside of the Aaronic line. He's outside the Levitical line, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, right? Not on a trivial matter of descent, but on something better, but by the power of an indestructible life. The ability to rise from the dead allows him to be a holy priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And then he quotes one of the Psalms. It says this, "For it is a witness of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And this is come from Psalm 110. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But you'll see that he's starting to develop this idea. Is Melchizedek was not part of the tribes of Israel. He was before. He was a contemporary of Abraham. So therefore, he is wholly different. Jesus never died, right? He died, was buried, and raised again. He lives forever. He's able to be a constant priest. He doesn't get tired. He doesn't get old. He doesn't retire. He is perpetually a high priest. And it says this, "For it is witness of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on one hand, a former command is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced, through which we draw near to God." It's interesting, in Acts, you see a similar thing echoed. For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep, and was laid with his fathers, and saw corruption. But he whom God raised up did not see corruption. Let it be known to you, therefore, brothers, that through this man forgiveness of sin is proclaimed to you. And by him, everyone who believes is freed from everything everything which you could not be freed by the law of Moses. The law of Moses could not free you from the sin debt. However, if you had a high priest who could intercede for you forever, that would. And he continues on this idea in the book of Romans, and it says this: For God has done what the law, weakened by flesh, could not do. How is it weakened? It could not perpetually do the duty. It had a limitation, which was death. By sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sins, he condemned sin in the flesh, in order that the righteousness requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh, but those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. Notice, again, the idea that there is something better, which is not limited by human inability, right? We can't live forever. I know that a bunch of billionaires and millionaires are trying their best to live as long as they can. However, they can't. Everybody eventually has to die. Eventually, everybody has to pay the Pied Piper. Sin has a devastating, wrecking effect on us. But the one who conquered sin and death, he is no longer bound to them, and he can live forever. Jesus is our permanent and perfect priest. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath. But this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Because Jesus was talked about that he was coming, and this is David writing in Psalm 110, verse 4, The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. If you look in Psalm 110, it's messianic. There is both king and priest presented in that chapter. And it's from David. David is writing this. And if we look again at the history of Israel, David is way after Moses. Way before Jesus, but also before Abraham, Moses, and then you get David. And so if David is writing that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, he's during the time of a priesthood, a Levitical priesthood. So even David sees through the Messianic promise that there will be a better promise. And this will not be a temporary priest. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So he's saying that you are called to be a king messianically, but you also will be a priest. And your priesthood will be non-Aaronic or non-Levitical, because it's going to be after Melchizedek. I don't know how many times I can jam Melchizedek into one sentence, but I tried my best. So Jesus, as our priest, is confirmed by oath, eternal, holy, once for all sacrifice, right? It's the idea that Jesus fits the bill for everything that we are missing for the Levitical priesthood. And here's the life application, right? Instability breeds anxiety, right? We know this, right? If things are not exactly solid, we get anxious, right? I have somebody in my life who's a little bit anxious, and when things are not concrete, when she does not have control, when they don't have control of the situation, they get very anxious about it. On the other hand, I'm a little bit more of like free. Like, yeah, okay, we roll the punches, but I also do love a good plan, right? I love it when a plan comes together. But also, I don't have this anxiety because I understand that life is just always kind of topsy-turvy. We never can control it. So that instability, right, breeds anxiety, right? I don't know if I'm secure. I don't know if God's going to save me. I don't know. And you go on and on. But permanence breeds peace. Your salvation is not held together by your consistency. It's not held together by you trying, by you interceding for you, by your priesthood, by your own actions, by you constantly offering sacrifices, but by Christ's unbreakable grip. And what he begins, he sustains. He is the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you cannot live. That's the repeated idea, is that Jesus is the sustainer of all life. The author of Hebrews picks up and says, the former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. You had high priest after high priest for generations and generations and generations. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the utmost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercessions for them. He doesn't go to sleep. He doesn't take a vacation. He doesn't take a break. He is always there at the right hand of the Father to continue to offer up this intercession. Now, I was thinking about this, and as I was thinking about this, I was like, what is the easiest way for people to understand this? And I think that this might help you, right? The Levitical law was a subscription that expires, right? You always had to renew, you always had to pay, and for some reason, the price always just went up a little bit, right? And they added weird rules and regulations, like you could only take 462 and a half steps, and you didn't have the idea that you couldn't like eat seeds and put them into your mouth because that was considered like sowing, and like it was all these different weird rules. But Jesus offers a permanent access. You buy it once, you get it once, and that's it. There's no need to upgrade, there is no need to buy the new software, there is no need to buy Overwatch 2, even though we are still fine with Overwatch 1. There was no reason. It's the idea that the priesthood was supposed to show you the shortcoming and failings, to point you to something better. And that's really, as I said before, the whole entire point of Hebrews is to show you that things were not great. Things were temporary. But the permanent thing has arrived. And as we said, right, the earthly priests were many, chosen, temporary, sinful. And we go, well, yeah, like I don't have a priesthood anymore. I don't really need to know that I don't have a priesthood. I've never been to a priest. Maybe I went to a Catholic one, but that's about it. What this is also saying is that it's also talking about our striving, our performance, right? Because if we think about it and we're honest, our performances are many, filthy, temporary, sinful. What we do, what we try to offer God, what we try to say, hey God, thank you for saving me, however, I want to add this, right? We're told in the Bible that our righteous deeds are like filthy rags. They don't even add up to something that is beneficial or good. They're not even like rags that you could use for cleaning. They're filthy rags. They've already been used. They're already tainted. And so for us as individuals, your working, your striving doesn't really add up to a whole lot. And so what the author of Hebrews is offering to you is to rest in what God has already accomplished for you. Right now, not metaphorically, but actually, Christ intercedes. That means your worst moment is met with advocacy, not abandonment. A lot of times we say, oh no, I can't take that to God. God will judge me for that. Or we try to clean it up. We say, look, it wasn't that bad. I only did this, and this, and this. But at least I'm not Michael. Right? At least I'm not, Hitler. Right? At least I'm not
Michael.
right? At least I'm not, right, whatever bad person or good person you want to put in there.
It's worse than what he said.
Right. That means your worst moment, right, which could be this moment, met with advocacy, not abandonment. Right? Michael could abandon his friendship in this moment. Right? Or he could say, you know what? Luke, you try your best sometimes. We all don't make it sometimes. We win some, we lose some, as is said. The author of Hebrew continues on this line of thought, and he says this. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. Other priests would have to make a sacrifice first, and then make other sacrifices so that they could intercede, so that they could cover just one sin. Not all the sins forever, just a sin. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath which came later than the law appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. And that's what Jesus is. He is eternal, right? And that's why we have, right now, as our priest, he is advocating for us, right? He is praying. He is securing, right? And this is not the idea that he has to fight for your salvation and hold on to it. No, it's the idea that it's a permanency. It's been secured, locked up. It is in his hands. He is not letting anything happen to it. In fact, it's double locked because this is what John writes to us. And it says, I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hands. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of the Father's hand. I and the Father are one. And so you are wrapped up in the Son's hands. You are wrapped up in the Father's hands. Nothing is getting at you. Isn't that much better than being weakly held in by the high priest? Hopefully he offered a good sacrifice. Hopefully he didn't think of something wrong and all of a sudden his sacrifice is meaningless. No, it is once and for all. So what is the better promise of Hebrews chapter 7? It shows us that Jesus is not a substitute in a long line of religious leaders. He is the final and forever mediator. Where human priests were temporary, limited, and flawed, Jesus is eternal, sinless, and sufficient. Our access to God does not depend on a fragile system, but on a living Savior who never stops interceding for us. Too often, I think that we forget this idea. We too often go back and revert to using our own ways of connecting to God when we already have the better way to connect to God. As we kind of close out and we head into our small group time,